Welcome to Human Monsters. I have covered cases concerning filicide in the past, with Ronald Gene Simmons and Marcus Wesson as two examples. No murder is anything less than horrifying, but when a parent makes their child or children the victim or victims of such a grisly act, it is especially heinous and shocking. Part of a parent's role in their child's life is that of protector, yet in some rare cases, they become the entity from whom the child needs protection. What leads a parent to murder their own children? They usually have reasons, but either they make no sense or they committed suicide immediately after murdering their children, and so their motives remain unknown or unclear. In this episode, I explore some stories of filicide and the horrifying aftermath witnessed by law enforcement personnel and envisioned by outsiders with a shudder. I'm not a parent myself, but I do get the impression that amid the love a parent feels for their child, there must be much darker feelings and motivations in the background, what you might refer to as the shadow, as outlined by Carl Jung. Nobody has the power to hurt you emotionally more than the people you love most, and children do often reject their parents. The following is a rundown on filicide by the National Library of Medicine. Child murder by parents, filicide, is one of the most upsetting types of crime. It is even more distressing when a mother kills her child than when a father does, because we expect mothers to be selfless and to love and protect their children at all costs. Mothers are supposed to be, quote, guided by natural feminine instincts that can infer an angelic temperament, make them clairvoyant about their children's needs, and willing to place their own desires second to those of their family, end quote. When Andrea Yates killed her 5 children, Newsweek asked, how can a mother commit such a crime against nature and all morality, and end the lives she has so recently born and nurtured? Historically, women who have killed their children have been considered monsters. The Puritans believed, quote, all women who killed their babies violated what was taken to be the law of nature decreed by God. The women who killed their children, then, they were by definition, quote, unnatural and, quote, monstrous, more hardened than the sea monsters who draw out their breasts and give such to their young ones. The media sometimes characterizes mothers who kill their children as either mad or bad. Women portrayed as mad have been characterized as morally pure women who, by all accounts, have conformed to traditional gender roles and notions of femininity. These women are often viewed as good mothers, and their crimes are considered irrational, uncontrollable acts, usually the direct result of mental illness. In contrast, women characterized as bad are depicted as cold, calloused, evil mothers who have often been neglectful of their children. The most quintessentially bad infanticidal mother is Susan Smith. An Australian headline stated that Susan Smith committed, quote, the mother of all crimes. The media relentlessly portrayed her as bad, even though the jury voted to spare her life. Fathers who kill their children evoke much less emotion because they are not expected to have the same unconditional love that mothers have for their children. The following stories feature situations in which a parent's rage toward their child and/or circumstances surrounding their family tap into the worst among their instincts and urges. 1. Francisca Rojas. On June 29, 1892, Francisca Rojas murdered her 2 children in Nicosia, Buenos Aires province, Argentina. Her eldest son, 6-year-old Ponciano Carballo Rojas, and her youngest son, 4-year-old Felisa, were both killed in the family's home. To deflect blame, Francisca slashed her own throat and blamed all the bloodshed on her neighbor, Pedro Ramon Velasquez. Police Inspector Alvarez became aware that Francisca's boyfriend said he would marry her, quote, except for those 2 brats. This case made history, not just because of the nature of the crime, but it was one of the first cases leading to a conviction based on the analysis of a fingerprint, that being Francisca's, which was smeared on a piece of furniture and sealed with blood. 2. Anoi Mznny. Anoi Mznny was a Russian war hero who served in World War II. On March 31st, 1952, his mother, Tatiana Mznaya, returned from work and found that her house was afire. Anatoly's son, 5-year-old Gennady, had been brutally murdered. There was a puncture wound in his head. His leg was broken at the knee. His body was covered with rags, including Anatoly's bloodied shirts and underpants. In the morning, Anatoly was found hiding in the cesspool of the latrine. There, his important papers were also found. He was sentenced to 25 years to be served at a labor camp. He was stripped of all the honors he received during his years of service in the military. 3. Jeffrey Robert Macdonald. Jeffrey Robert Macdonald was a doctor and captain in the U.S. Army who was convicted in August 1979 of killing his pregnant wife and his 2 daughters, which occurred in February of 1970. His wife, Colette, was found lying on the floor with one eye open and one breast exposed. She had been clubbed all over her body, with her forearms having been broken in the process. She was stabbed 21 times in the chest with an ice pick, and 16 times in the neck and chest with a knife. Her trachea was severed in 2 locations. A pajama top was draped over her chest. It was torn and bloodied. A paring knife had been left on the floor beside her. Jeffrey Macdonald was found lying face down, wounded with his head on her chest and an arm around her neck. They lived in military housing, and when a serviceman approached, Macdonald said to him, "Check my kids. I heard my kids crying." 5-year-old Kimberly was found on her bed, where she had been bludgeoned on her head and body. She was stabbed in the neck with a knife between 8 and 10 times. She was lying on her left side. Her skull was fractured twice by blows visited upon the right side of her head. There was a wound on her face so severe it caused her cheekbone to protrude through her skin. The blows dealt to her head were so critical that they resulted in bruising on her brain, a coma, and death shortly thereafter. 2-year-old Kristen was found in her bed, lying on her left side, with a baby bottle adjacent to her mouth. She was stabbed 33 times in her chest, neck, hands, and back with a knife, and 15 times with an ice pick. 2 of the knife wounds punctured her heart. The ice pick wounds were shallow, not that that made a difference. A coroner determined that the injuries on her hands were likely incurred as she made an effort to defend herself. On the headboard of Jeffrey and Colette's bed, the word pig had been scrawled, as if in the hopes that the Manson family might be blamed. Macdonald always insisted he was innocent, that the murders were committed by 3 intruders, 1 female and 2 males. He said they used knives, clubs, and ice picks. Nevertheless, the prosecution emphasized the physical evidence that indicated Macdonald as the guilty party. Macdonald filed appeals, and it is looked upon as one of the most litigated criminal cases in U.S. history. 4. John Emil List. John List murdered his wife, mother, and children on November 9th, 1971, at their home in Westfield, New Jersey. He disappeared afterwards and remained a fugitive until he was apprehended with the help of the television program America's Most Wanted. He cited as his motivation to kill his relatives financial problems and the fact that they were distancing themselves from their religion's strictures. He killed them with his 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic handgun and his father's Colt .22 caliber revolver. While his kids were at school, he shot his wife Helen, 47 years old, in the back of the head. From there, he killed his 84-year-old mother, Alma, just above her left eye. When his daughter, 16-year-old Patricia, and his 13-year-old son, Frederick, came home from school, he shot each of them in the back of the head. Within the hour after killing all 4 of them, List made himself some lunch and proceeded to drive to his bank to close his and his mother's accounts. List had had a troubled marriage to Helen. She was an alcoholic and had syphilis, which she caught from her first husband. She would frequently humiliate John by comparing his sexual performances to that of her first husband, insisting her first husband was superior between the sheets. He was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. A court-appointed psychiatrist diagnosed him with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. He felt there were only 2 possible solutions to his life situation: kill his family or accept welfare. He refused to go on welfare because of the fear of ridicule and condemnation. He also recalled his father's views on social assistance as being a point of shame for a father whose charge it is to provide for his family through hard work. In an interview with Connie Chung, he said, "I wish I had never done what I did. I've regretted my action and prayed for forgiveness ever since." He died of pneumonia on March 21st, 2008. Five, Elizabeth Diane Downs. Elizabeth Downs murdered her daughter and attempted to kill her 2 sons near Springfield, Oregon on May 19, 1983. She told the police that a man carjacked her and shot the children as a follow-up. She was found guilty of the crime, convicted, and sentenced to 25 years in prison. She managed to escape in 1987, but was soon captured. She has been diagnosed with narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial personality disorders. One expert labeled her a, quote, deviant sociopath. Her marriage to her husband, Steve, was plagued by fighting due to allegations of infidelity and financial stress. It also didn't help that her son, Daniel, was the product of an extramarital affair. Steve noted that she was completely lacking in maternal instinct. As he put it, Diane forbade everything to her children. If Danny demanded a little attention, she rejected him. But the worst was when one day I caught Cheryl jumping on her bed. I told her that it was not allowed, and I made her sit down and think about what she had done. Cheryl remained calm while looking up and asked, "Is there a gun here?" I replied that no, and the reason for this question, to which she told me, "I want to kill me. My mom says I'm bad." On May 19th, 1983, Diane shot her kids and drove them in a blood-soaked car to a hospital. 3-year-old Danny was paralyzed from the waist down by the attack. 8-year-old Christy had a stroke that left her disabled. Cheryl Lynn Downs, 7 years old, did not survive. Diane shot herself in her left arm. Investigators found it odd that Diane was so calm at the time. Normally, a carjacking and the shootings of one's children would be traumatic for the average person. They also noticed that there was no blood on the driver's side of her car. It was revealed during legal proceedings that she wanted to get rid of the children because she wanted to marry her boyfriend who did not want to provide for her kids. Downs was designated a dangerous offender, negating the possibility that she will ever be released, except as a corpse. 6. Joseph Barcie. Joseph Barcie is known for murdering his daughter, Judith Barcie, along with his wife before taking his own life. Judith was 10 years old at the time of her death. She was an actress who played roles both on screen and as a voice for animated films. She played Ducky in The Land Before Time and Anne Marie in All Dogs Go to Heaven. She was earning over $100,000 a year at one point, enabling her family to buy a house. As Judith's success continued along its ascendant trajectory, Joseph, an alcoholic, began lashing out at his family. He would frequently threaten to kill himself, Judith, and her mother, Maria. He was arrested 3 times for DUI charges. Judith played a role in the film Jaws: The Revenge. When she was about to depart for her scheduled shooting dates, Joseph held a knife to her throat and threatened to kill her if she did not return. In December 1986, Maria reported Joseph's threats and physical abuse to the police. The police found no physical evidence of abuse, so Maria decided against pressing charges. After Maria went to police and reported his abusive behavior, Joseph quit drinking, but this did not put a stop to his abusive behavior. He even threatened to burn down the house. His paranoia increased to the point where, when a telegram was sent to Maria informing her that a relative in Hungary had died, he concealed it from her out of fear that she would take Judith there with her and never return. The physical abuse continued, and at one point, Judith told a friend that her father threw pots and pans at her one day, making contact with her face, leading to a nosebleed. The abuse took a toll on Judith psychologically, and she began to overeat and developed compulsive behaviors as a distraction, including plucking out her eyelashes and pulling out her cat's whiskers. In May 1988, Judith could not repress her feelings any longer, and she broke down in front of her agent. Her agent took her to a child psychologist. The therapist detected signs of trauma spearheaded by the emotional and physical abuse and referred the case to Child Protective Services. CPS withdrew their investigative efforts when Maria informed them she was on the cusp of divorcing Joseph. Maria had rented an apartment as a sanctuary of sorts to escape Joseph's abuse. She considered taking Maria with her to live there full-time, but she was hesitant to do so because she feared she would lose her house and possessions. The abuse Judith suffered at home continued to affect her, and one day she said to her friend, "I'm afraid to go home. My daddy is miserable. My daddy is drunk every day, and I know he wants to kill my mother." On July 28, 1988, the Los Angeles Times reported that 3 people were found dead in what appeared to be a murder-suicide. Joseph shot Maria in the hallway of their home. He shot Judith in her bed. According to one investigator, a flammable liquid like gasoline was poured on Maria and Judith's bodies. Joseph's corpse was found in the garage, where he died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Don Bluth, the director of The Land Before Time and All Dogs Go to Heaven, spoke very highly of Judith and declared that he would have continued working with her. In an interview, he described Judith as, quote, "absolutely astonishing. She understood verbal direction, even for the most sophisticated situations." Susan Smith. Susan Smith became a public figure in 1994 for murdering her 2 sons, 3-year-old Michael and 1-year-old Alexander. She strapped them to their car seats and sent the car veering into John D. Long Lake in South Carolina, where the boys drowned. Her actions triggered significant outrage among the public, not just because of the murders, but because she falsely claimed that a black man carjacked her and kidnapped her sons. Susan had a troubled background in her youth. Her father committed suicide when she was 6 years old. She attempted suicide when she was 13 years old. Her mother married a man named Beverly C. Russell Jr., who molested Susan during her adolescence. However traumatic it may have been initially, she continued to have sexual relations with Russell up to 6 months before the murders of her sons. After graduating from high school in 1989, Smith attempted suicide for the second time when a married man with whom she had an affair ended the relationship. It was October 25, 1994, when Susan reported to police that she was the victim of a carjacking perpetrated by an African-American man who she claimed also abducted her sons. Susan appeared on national television to plead for the public's help in returning her sons to her custody. A nationwide search was carried out, but failed to locate the boys. On November 3rd, she confessed to letting her car submerge into the lake with her sons inside. She cited as her motive a desire to win the affections of a wealthy man with whom she was affiliated, a man who made it clear to her that he did not want children in his life. She was convicted and sentenced to 30 years. She applied for parole but was denied. Robert William Fisher. Robert William Fisher was a military veteran who had become extremely abusive to his family at home. In 1987, Robert married Mary Cooper. They had 2 children, a daughter named Brittany and a son named Bobby. He was not favorably described by his family. He was remembered as cruel and distant. He was a tyrant who demanded control and exerted a highly domineering approach to parenting. Robert and Mary frequently fought, and the common denominators were sex and money. Mary began to work outside the home to build up what she referred to as a security fund. Once, when he considered Mary to have spoken out of turn, he sprayed her with a garden hose. Bobby was not interested in hunting and fishing, and this caused Robert a great deal of embarrassment. One day he tried to teach Bobby and Brittany how to swim by throwing them off a boat. Robert's friend Sandy Gillespie accompanied Robert on his hunting and fishing expeditions, and he spoke of Robert's abusive behavior toward his children. They were crying, and Brittany was screaming, and he pulled them back in the boat, and he said, "Now there, how's that?" To give a clearer idea of how controlling Robert was, he refused to allow the house's walls to be painted any color but white, and he also dictated what he considered to be an appropriate number of photos and paintings on the walls. To quote Mary's friend Kimberly Sue Davidson, several times her mother had made special things like quilts. She was not allowed to hang them up. She had to store them in the closet. And then he would continually tell her, "Isn't it time you got rid of this stuff?" His mother reported that his father was similarly domineering and that she did not stand up to him. She felt that Robert was emulating his father, who maintained emotional distance from his family for fear of losing them. Some of Robert's behavior was just plain bizarre. A friend noted that once when they went on a hunting trip, Robert killed an elk and smeared some of its blood on his face as war paint. On another occasion, he snuck up on a family who were having a picnic and emptied his gun by firing it into the air, disturbing their maul. One day he shot a stray pit bull. He had once been active in the men's ministry of a church, but eventually he withdrew his participation. In 1998, he openly mused about committing suicide because of the state of his marriage. This, despite the fact that he had been the one that had spoiled his relationship with his wife. He had an encounter with a prostitute in a massage parlor, and due to his lack of protection, he developed a urinary tract infection. The infection caused him considerable discomfort as he suffered through December 2000. Their neighbor, Wade Rensock, spoke of the sputtering marriage from his vantage point. They screamed constantly. Everybody heard it. You could hear it in the house next door, and you never really heard him scream, which is kind of weird. I mean, he had a way about him, but you never heard him scream. You always heard his wife screaming. Things like, "You're worthless. I could have done better than you. We should get a divorce." Robert intimated to friends that he considered renewing his marriage vows because he couldn't bear the thought of losing his family. Weeks before the murders, Mary confided to friends that she was on the verge of divorcing Robert. On April 9th, 2001, a neighbor heard yet another loud fight broadcasting from the Fisher domicile. The next day, at 8:42 a.m., the Fisher house exploded. When firefighters examined the wreckage, they found that Mary had been shot in the head. Brittany and Bobby's throats were slashed from ear to ear. They were all killed in their beds. Investigators speculated that Robert's motive was his fear of losing Mary and the children through a divorce, and "if I can't have them, nobody can" type scenario. A nationwide manhunt was launched, with the case even being profiled on America's Most Wanted and John Walsh's The Hunt. Robert Fisher remains at large. 9. Andrea Pia Yates. Andrea Yates is known for murdering her 5 children by drowning them in her bathtub on June 20th, 2001. She was diagnosed with severe postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, and schizophrenia. She married devout evangelical Christian Russell Rusty Yates, and they vowed to be as fruitful as possible and multiply often, leading to the conception of their 5 children. After the birth of their 4th child, Luke, Andrea's recurring depression reemerged. On June 16, 1999, Rusty found Andrea in an agitated state, shaking and chewing on her fingers. The next day, she attempted suicide by overdosing on prescription medication. She was hospitalized and put on antidepressants. Before long, Andrea approached Rusty and asked him for his consent to let her die, holding a knife to her throat to prove how serious her suicidal ideation was. She was hospitalized once again and was prescribed an antipsychotic drug. Her mental health presented with a marked improvement once she began the regimen of taking the medication. Rusty moved the family to a smaller house as a means to help Andrea cope. It appeared to have stabilized her. In July 1999, Andrea had a nervous breakdown. She attempted suicide twice and was hospitalized twice. She was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis. One doctor attempted to dissuade Andrea and Rusty from conceiving another child, as it would put Andrea at risk of regressing back into postpartum psychosis. 7 weeks after Andrea was discharged from a hospital, she and Rusty conceived their 5th child, a girl named Mary, who was born 8 months later. Their situation was stable until the death of Andrea's father on March 12, 2001. She was unable to cope and discontinued the intake of her medication. She engaged in self-harm, which manifested in cutting herself. She read the Bible obsessively. She stopped feeding Mary. Andrea's condition deteriorated to such a degree that she was hospitalized once again. She was admitted on April 1st. She was released after doctors determined that she had recovered. On May 3rd, 2001, Andrea's mental condition relapsed, and she became catatonic. She filled her bathtub and considered drowning her children that day. She was admitted to hospital the following day when a doctor concluded that she intended to drown herself. On June 20th, 2001, Rusty departed for work, leaving Andrea alone with the children, which was ill-advised given her mental condition. A doctor recommended that Andrea be monitored 24 hours a day. Rusty's mother was scheduled to arrive an hour after his departure. By the time she pulled up, Andrea had drowned all of her children. She drowned Paul, Luke, and John first and laid them on her bed. She had left Mary floating in the tub. When she returned to the bathroom, she drowned Mary. Noah approached Andrea to ask her what was wrong with Mary. He ran, but Andrea caught up with him and dragged him to the bathroom, whereupon she drowned him. She placed Mary in John's arms. Noah was left floating in the tub. Andrea called the police, but refused to tell the dispatcher why she needed assistance from first responders. She called Rusty at work and told him he needed to return home right away. During Andrea Yates' trial, her attorneys brought her history of mental illness to the attention of the jury, who recommended a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, and she was placed in a psychiatric hospital. One of her doctors refused to continue her prescription for the antipsychotic medication that had enabled her to achieve mental stability. Of Dr. Saeed, Rusty said, "The real question to me is, how could she have been so ill and the medical community not diagnose her, not treat her, and obviously not protect our family from her?" Rusty testified that he never knew that she had visions and voices. He said he never knew she had considered killing the children. Neither did Dr. Saeed, even though the delusions could have been found in medical records from 1999. He reluctantly prescribed Haldol, the same drug that worked in a drug cocktail for her in 1999. But after a few weeks, he took her off the drug, citing his concerns about side effects. Though her condition seemed to be worsening 2 days before the drownings, when Rusty drove her to Dr. Saeed's office, he testified the doctor refused to try Haldol longer or return her to the hospital. Rusty Yates divorced Andrea and remarried. Andrea remains incarcerated. Dena Schlloer. Dena Schlloer is a Texan native, having lived in the municipality of Plano. She murdered her daughter, Margaret, when she was 10 months old. Dena was born with a condition called hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus causes cerebral spinal fluid to build up in the brain to the point where it can create considerable pressure within the skull. Other complications include mental illness, visual impairment, headaches. When the patient is a senior, they may experience difficulty maintaining balance, incontinence, and other mental and psychological complications. Infants may present with increasing head size, atypical of a normal baby's rate of physical development. Other symptoms of the disorder include vomiting, insomnia, epilepsy, and downward pointing of the eyes. Dena Schlloer was not spared from the hardships of living with the condition. She underwent 8 surgeries to implant shunts into her brain, heart, and abdomen, all by the age of 13. Despite her difficulties with the disease, she managed to obtain a degree in psychology. She met her husband while she was attending university. Dena gave birth to Margaret in 2004. A day later, Dena attempted suicide. She was hospitalized in a psych ward and was diagnosed as bipolar with psychotic features. Dena was the subject of an investigation by Child Protective Services when her episode of mental illness came to light. CPS decided it was inadvisable to allow Margaret to be in Dena's custody unsupervised. Her sister-in-law moved in and remained until CPS concluded the investigation. One product of Dena's psychosis was her belief that Margaret was destined to marry Doyle Davidson, who was a veterinarian and became their pastor. Dena told her husband that she wanted to give Margaret to Davidson. Later that day, he spanked her with a wooden spoon in front of their children. Dena's mental health condition worsened. Having completely lost touch with reality, Dena took up a knife and cut off both of Margaret's arms. Margaret perished shortly thereafter. Her other 2 children were not harmed. She told a psychologist that her motive was crafted after watching a news program on television that reported a story about a boy who had been mauled by a lion. She interpreted this as a sign that the apocalypse was imminent. She went on to say that God commanded her to sever Margaret's arms and then her own. The attack has been described as religious frenzy. The psychologist diagnosed her with postpartum psychosis. Dena was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital. Her roommate, Andrea Yates. 11. Chris Benois. Chris Benois is known for two things: his career in professional wrestling and for murdering his wife and son. Chris had two children, David and Megan, with his first wife, Martina. Their marriage dissolved around 1997. Chris became involved with Nancy Sullivan, who had been married to a WCW booker. They had a son named Daniel on February 25, 2000. On November 23rd of that year, they married. In 2003, Nancy filed for divorce. She noted that the marriage was, in her words, irrevocably broken. She also reported that Benois had subjected her to what she characterized as cruel treatment. She said he would break furniture and throw it around. She also filed a restraining order, though she would later have both motions rescinded. On June 25, 2007, Fayetteville, Georgia police carried out a welfare check at Benoit's home. He was performing for WWE at the time, and they were concerned after he missed several events. They found Chris, Nancy, and Daniel dead. The murder-suicide occurred over a period of 3 days. Nancy was bound before she was killed. Benoit gave Daniel Xanax and strangled him while he was unconscious. Chris hung himself on his lat pull-down machine. The autopsy disclosed that Nancy had Xanax, hydrocodone, and hydromorphone in her system. Chris was found to have high testosterone due to the ingestion of anabolic steroids, leading to the theory that he committed the murder amid an episode of roid rage. Other theories had it that Benoit may have experienced psychotic episodes due to the concussions he sustained throughout his wrestling career. Clay and Sheila Fletcher. On January 3rd, 2022, Lacy Ellen Fletcher, 36 years old, was found dead on the living room couch of her parents, Clay and Sheila Fletcher. Lacy had been imprisoned inside her parents' home for 12 years due to ongoing health problems that progressed continually along a trajectory of further decline. She was neglected by her parents to the point that they refused to seek medical care for her. Lacy's overall life was marked by hardship. She was autistic and was bullied mercilessly at school. To spare her from this mistreatment any further, they decided to homeschool Lacy. Clay and Sheila resented the responsibility of providing for Lacy in the roles of caregivers. Instead of taking her to doctors to receive treatment, they just left her to languish on the couch. They placed towels on the couch so that they would absorb the urine and feces as Lacy evacuated her organic waste. Compared to Lacy's spot in the living room, the rest of the household was kept clean, with the upper level reportedly immaculate. Lacy did not venture upstairs due to limited mobility. Lacy lost weight over time to the point where her clothing became so loose it draped off her body. It didn't help that when Clay and Sheila went on vacation, they left no provisions for Lacy to feed herself and nobody to check in on her. She would simply starve throughout the entirety of their absence. Lacy's muscles atrophied due to disuse, and vermin fed on her lower extremities underneath the couch. Mouse droppings and maggots blanketed that area. Speculation has it that she tried to lift herself off the couch to avoid the pain she was in, but her mobility was far too restricted to allow it. This enabled her to become adhered to the couch, which was made possible by the urine and feces that covered her body and the couch. There were maggots inside her hair and in her orifices. Not only was Lacy's body starved, but she suffered bone infections. This process led to the sepsis that resulted in her death. At the time of her death, there was feces and couch cushion material under her fingernails and in her stomach. It was inferred based on this that she attempted to escape by gnawing at the parts of the couch that prevented the detachment. All this occurred while Clay and Sheila were away on vacation. Lacy weighed a mere 96 pounds at the time of her death. A coroner determined that she was dead 2 days before her parents discovered she had expired. Clay and Sheila contacted 911 and were instructed on how to perform CPR by the dispatcher, but of course they were 2 days too late. They lied to the police, telling them that Lacy elected to live on the couch for 12 years. They did not have the credibility to back up that claim, especially after the coroner ruled that the death was a homicide. However hard-boiled the investigators might have been after years of law enforcement, they experienced considerable trauma from this case. In fact, the nature of the indignities Lacy suffered were so horrific and morbid. They suffered disruptions to their ability to carry out their daily routines, like eating and sleeping. In May 2022, Clay and Sheila Fletcher were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. They were released on bail. The judge dismissed the charge, but they were re-indicted of murder by a grand jury in June 2023. February 6, 2024, Clay and Sheila pleaded no contest pursuant to the reduction of the charge to manslaughter as part of a plea deal. Otherwise, they would have likely received life sentences with no possibility of parole. The prosecutor sought a 40-year prison sentence. On March 20th, 2024, Sheila and Clay were sentenced to 20 years with a consecutive 20-year suspended sentence. (13) Elisas Law. Elisa Izquierdo was born on February 11, 1989, in Brooklyn, New York. Her father, Gustavo, was a Cuban immigrant, and her mother, Awilda, is from Puerto Rico. The couple met at a homeless shelter 2 years before Elisa's birth. Gustavo worked there as a caterer and janitor. Awilda was staying at the shelter temporarily, as she was evicted from an apartment in which she cohabited with her ex-boyfriend, with whom she had 2 children, due to their failure to pay rent because so much of her money was spent on crack cocaine. Gustavo broke up with Awilda when he discovered that she was using crack cocaine while pregnant. She lost custody of her first 2 children due to her substance abuse. Her family took care of her children. Awilda was still using crack when Elisa was born. Social workers notified CPS. When her addiction was proven, custody of Elisa was awarded to Gustavo. Despite his inexperience with parenting, he was reportedly a dedicated and loving father, even going as far as to attend parenting classes and seeking advice from relatives on how to care for Elisa effectively. To quote a family friend, Elisa was his life. He would always say she was his princess. The year when Elisa was enrolled in preschool, A social worker signed an affidavit that stated that Awilda had overcome her addiction and was situated in an apartment. She had gotten married and was expecting her fourth child. In December, she gave birth to her daughter, Taisha, and regained custody of her two oldest children. In November 1991, Awilda obtained the right to have unsupervised visits with Elisa. She was entitled to visitations every second weekend. Her two eldest children reported to relatives that during Elisa's visits with Awilda, she would be beaten and neglected by both Awilda and Elisa's stepfather. The relatives did not report the abuse to the authorities. Elisa's father and her teachers noticed bruises and other signs of physical abuse whenever she was returned to Gustavo. Elisa did not report all of the abuse. There were signs of sexual abuse in her genitalia. She also didn't inform Gustavo that not only did Awilda beat her, but she would lock her in a closet. She did, however, state that she had no interest in visiting with her mother again. Other signs of the traumas Elisa suffered at her mother's home began to manifest at this time, like bedwetting, irritable bowel syndrome, and nightmares. The nightmares were at their peak when her visits with her mother were imminent. A relative noted that when Elisa returned to her father, she would vomit and refused to enter bathrooms. Elisa reported the abuse to a social worker in 1992, and Gustavo campaigned to have Awilda's visitation rights rescinded. The court ruled that Awilda's visits with Elisa could continue with a proviso that Awilda must never visit physical violence upon her daughter. In 1993, Gustavo resolved to return to Cuba and bring Elisa with him. He even went as far as to purchase airline tickets for them, with the trip scheduled for May 26, 1994. The trip was not to be. In May, Gustavo was diagnosed with lung cancer and succumbed to complications leading to his death. He died on May 26th, on the day of the flight that would have changed both their lives. When Elisa asked Awilda where her father was, Awilda screamed, "Your father's dead!" School officials contacted their family court judge to inform him of their concerns regarding the implications of Awilda gaining full custody of Elisa. Relatives also voiced their objections, with a cousin going as far as to offer to adopt Elisa. Attorneys and other legal representatives insisted that Awilda receive permanent custody. In September 1994, Awilda was granted full custody. Shortly after assuming full custody, Awilda withdrew Elisa from the private school she was attending and placed her in a public school. Teachers at this school recalled that Elisa was withdrawn and emotionally disturbed, nearly catatonic, and urinated frequently. She also presented with bruises and acquired an irregular gait. She had also begun to tear out chunks of her hair. On March 14, 1995, a letter was received by Manhattan child welfare authorities that was written by an anonymous sender. The letter was a report on the treatment Elisa received at her mother's home. Awilda was alleged to have cut off large sections of Elisa's hair and had taken to locking her in a closet for long periods of time. 6 days after receipt of the letter, Elisa was admitted to hospital with a fractured shoulder. The injury had not been treated for 3 days. Staff of Elisa's school also notified Manhattan child welfare authorities that they observed signs of physical abuse on Elisa's body. The Manhattan Child Welfare Authorities responded by saying the injuries were, quote, unreportable because of a dearth of evidence. Awilda relapsed into crack cocaine addiction once again, and it was during that period when the abuse of Elisa escalated. Awilda withdrew Elisa from school in December 1994. She made no effort to enroll her in any other school. Awilda had had 6 children by that point, but the majority of the abuse was directed at Elisa. Elisa was locked in her bedroom and was seldom allowed to socialize with her siblings. She was forbidden from leaving the apartment and was not permitted to use the bathroom. She relieved herself into a chamber pot. Neighbors reported hearing Elisa being tortured. They inferred that she was being abused when they heard her shout things like, "Mommy, Mommy, please stop. No more. I'm sorry." The neighbors reported the abuse to child welfare authorities, but no action was taken. Some of the neighbors later reported that Awilda referred to Elisa as a, quote, mongoloid and a, quote, filthy little whore who was placed under a spell by her father. Awilda once called an official representing a federally funded parenting program to report that Elisa was incontinent, cut off her hair, and drank out of the toilet. The official reported these findings to Manhattan Child Welfare Authorities, but they rejected his request to investigate the situation further. The abuse continued and worsened incrementally, which was often witnessed by Elisa's siblings. The abuse involved punching and kicking Lisa. She was forced to eat her own feces and drink ammoniated water. She would mop the floor with Elisa's head and face. Burns were inflicted on Elisa's body at her head, face, lips, and other regions of her body. She was raped vaginally and anally with a hairbrush and toothbrush. She was hung from a shower rod for Awilda and her boyfriend's amusement. A chest of drawers was dropped on Elisa's ring finger and toe. Awilda's boyfriend, Carlos Lopez, who was also a drug user, frequently beat and neglected Elisa, as well as her 2 older siblings. On November 15th, Carlos was taken into custody and put in jail for a parole violation. A week later, on November 22nd, Awilda called her sister, Mercy Torres, and said that Elisa was, quote, like retarded on the bed. Fluid was leaking from Elisa's nose and mouth. It was found later to be cranial fluid. Awilda also told Mercy that Elisa would not eat or drink. Mercy advised Awilda to take Elisa to a hospital. Awilda said she would, quote, think about it. She wanted to do the dishes first. The following morning, Awilda asked a neighbor to examine Elisa's body. Elisa was, for the most part, unresponsive to external stimuli, but there were some discernible vital signs. The neighbor told her to take her to a hospital. Awilda refused. The neighbor took it upon herself to contact police and an ambulance. Awilda threatened to commit suicide, apparently laboring under the delusion that her death would be the subject of mourning. Once in custody, Awilda confessed that she threw Elisa headfirst into a concrete wall 2 days before Elisa was brought to hospital. She said Elisa did not walk or talk after the attack. The autopsy revealed numerous injuries, including broken fingers, one bone of which was protruding through the skin, a broken toe, internal organ damage, deep welts and bruises across her head, face, and body. Her genitals and rectum presented with tearing. 30 circular marks on her body were determined to be impressions made by a ring worn by the assailant. The autopsy concluded that the abuse was inflicted over a long period of time. Lieutenant Louis Gonzalez of the NYPD was quoted as saying, "In my 22 years of service with the New York City Police Department, this is the worst case of child abuse I have ever seen." Elisa's funeral took place on November 29, 1995. The service was officiated by Reverend Gianni Augustinelli. There were 300 mourners in attendance. At one point, Augustinelli said Elisa was not just murdered by her mother, but by the, quote, silence of many, by the neglect of child welfare institutions, and the moral mediocrity that has intoxicated our neighborhoods. A wake was held at Elisa's burial. Among the attendees were politicians, Prince Michael of Greece, who financed her private school education and who found Elisa to be charming and sweet, neighbors, and myriad members of the public who were moved by the story. It was an open coffin funeral. Funeral home workers placed makeup on her face to conceal her injuries. She wore a crown of white flowers, and a red rose was placed in her hand. Her coffin was festooned with white flowers. A Barbie doll given to her by Gustavo and cherished by Elisa was placed next to her body. Mourners placed other toys, stuffed animals, and flowers and notes expressing sympathy in the coffin. Inscribed on her tombstone were the words, "World, please watch over the children." On June 26, 1996, Awilda Lopez pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The plea deal was to render her eligible for parole after serving 15 years in prison. The plea deal was granted. The judge, outraged at the outcome of the conditions in Elisa's life, said, "We have not created procedures to do everything necessary to protect the young and vulnerable in this society. The system has failed to protect our babies. And don't tell me how much it costs. If anything good comes from this horrendous tragedy, it will be that we give priority to these babies." Awilda Lopez applied for but was denied parole in 2010. She was denied parole in January 2022. On April 19th of that year, she was released. Carlos Lopez also incurred consequences for his contributions to the abuse. He was sentenced to 1.5 to 3 years in prison. The charge stemmed from a specific incident that occurred on October 31st, 1995, when he repeatedly banged Elisa's head into a concrete wall as her siblings looked on. He pleaded guilty to a charge of second-degree assault. He claimed that he never actually assaulted Elisa, but took the fall to spare his children the hardship of testifying against him. Considerable outrage from the public manifested in criticism of Manhattan child welfare authorities, who failed to act sufficiently to intervene and withdraw Elisa from the abusive situation at her mother's home. This was buttressed by the extensive national media focus the case attracted. Judge Greenbaum was also subjected to condemnation for her decision to place Elisa back into the full-time custody of her mother, whose drug addiction and abuse of Elisa were well documented. Greenbaum defended her actions by stating that she was simply following procedural recommendations. Rudolph Giuliani, who was mayor at the time, expressed his condolences, but not to the family and friends of Elisa. Rather, he stood behind Judge Greenbaum, saying, "The judge ultimately makes the decision based on all the facts and records, and is supposed to go behind those things to make determinations. He did, however, call for a review of the child welfare system. It must have been related to his initial reaction, which was demonstrably tone deaf. It led to the creation of the Administration for Children's Services. On February 12, 1996, Governor George Pataki signed Elisas Law into legislation. Many of Elisa's relatives were present when it was signed, as were the social workers and teachers who attempted to rescue Elisa from the abuse. The law was devised to balance the need for increased accountability through public awareness and governmental oversight with the privacy interests of individuals involved in Child Protective Services cases, emphasizing the deaths of children who presented with a history of child abuse reportage. Elisa's siblings were victims of her abuse as witnesses. Because their father was incarcerated, they were placed in foster homes. The abuse visited upon Lisa was so traumatic for them in observation that they would go on to suffer symptoms of psychological trauma, like post-traumatic stress disorder. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.